Hey again. In a screencast, I want to sort of quickly go over the idea of CSS frameworks and components or libraries. These are all sort of the same thing, just different ways of saying the same thing. The basic idea, though, is that there's a huge community of developers out there. Front-end developers meaning people that focus on HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and then of course programming back-end developers as well. So there's a huge community out there, and a lot of people, as they create things, like to sort of bundle it up and offer it back out to the public for them to use. So usually these are presented as components or libraries or frameworks. The basic idea being it's code that has been created and is being shared for reuse. So like, sort of a set of code that can be reused and incorporated into any number of other sites. Of course, the thing to keep in mind with this is you do need to pay attention to licensing. So anytime you're going to use someone else's code or someone else's image or someone else's anything, you need to figure out, do they require credit? Do they require payment? Is it free to use, but you can only use it on a personal site, not on a site you're getting paid for, etc. So that's on you to make sure that you read through any licensing agreements and use accordingly. Excuse me. But the main thing I want to get across in this screencast is that there are a ton of components, libraries, examples out there that other people have already created and tested that you can basically. It's a little more complicated than copy and paste, but essentially copy and paste and reuse in what you're creating. Not as a way to be lazy, just to sort of add extra design elements or interactivity to what you're doing. So to make it better, not to take the shortcut. Okay, so what I want to do is just sort of show you a couple examples of what I mean by these CSS components. What I'm looking at right now is a website put together by this developer. His name is Ian Lunn. I honestly don't remember how I came across this in the first place. I think I was just looking for CSS hover effects that were a little more interesting than what I was creating. And I came across this library. Basically, this developer put together, when I scroll down here, a whole bunch of hover effects that you can use on buttons. So this is all CSS. So as I'm hovering over these buttons, which of course a button is just a link, just uses the anchor tag, and it has been styled to look like a button, meaning it has a background color and some padding. That's it. So he has created CSS that creates all of these effects. It is utilizing the hover pseudo class. When you hover over these buttons, this thing happens. It's also using CSS transitions. I have not created a screencast on transitions, but there is a lecture that goes over transitions. The idea with transitions, CSS transitions, is you can basically when you're going from a regular state to a hover state, for example, you can tell the CSS to create a transition between those two states. So if the first state is a black background, the second state, the hover state, is a white background. If you add a transition, it will basically fade the color from black to white. So again, this guy is just using hover and transitions to create all of these effects. And of course, there's some icons incorporated here. So he's created all these, and he's basically put it out there for other developers to incorporate into their own work. So there's this whole website here, and it's got a tutorial, some documentation that you can read through. What I want to do is just kind of run through what it means to add a CSS component or someone else's CSS code into your own site. So let me switch over to this page here. So this is a page I put together for this example. Obviously, it's really just a bunch of text. Here is an example of a button, just a plain old button that I've created. If we look at that in my code, got a little space here. Here is my button. An anchor tag. The href isn't going anywhere right now, but that's where you would put in the link to the other page. And I have a class called button. When I go up to my CSS, this class called button just simply has a background color, a border, and some padding. So that's what makes this look a little less like a text link, like what we have up here, and more like a button. So what I'm going to do is I would like to incorporate one of this guy's hover effects. I'm going to just sort of randomly select one of these. The process, if you were to read through his tutorial, is number one, you have to include the CSS. So you have to find where they make it available. So you would download from GitHub. In that download, there would be a CSS file. You would copy and paste that. You would copy and paste it. That's what I have right here. Save it as a CSS file and include that CSS file on your page. So this is just a regular CSS file, so I'm going to include it as I do any external CSS file using the link attribute. I've named it hover.css, so href pointing to the file I just created using code that I downloaded from this site using CSS code. So I include the file, specify what kind of file it is. It's a style sheet. So that's the first step. Whenever you use one of these libraries, you have to get the CSS and save it locally, and then add it as an external CSS file to the document that you're working with. The next step is usually most of these CSS components, the way they work is once you have the CSS being referenced, usually it's just a matter of adding a class. So all of these classes, so when I look at this code here using the inspector, so the fade, the back pulse, the sweep to right, so these are all, as you can see, just links, and they have classes. So all of these classes, all of these CSS classes are defined by this developer, Ian Lunn. So he created a bunch of CSS that has all these effects, put them in a single CSS file. That's what I copied and pasted and added to my document using this external CSS. So to use it, I just need to find the effect I want, copy that class name. So I'm going to do this sweep to right one. And since I have included all of that CSS, we can assume that in the CSS file there is a class being defined called hvr-sweep to right. So now all I need to do is just add that class to my button. So you'll notice that my button, or my link that I created, already has a class called button. That's the one I defined in my embedded CSS at the top. I'm going to add an additional class. Remember, you can have multiple classes and even an ID on a single element. When you have multiple classes, they're just separated by a space. So I'm going to save that, go back to my file, and now when I hover over at that link, I've got that effect. So all I had to do was find it, of course, make sure that I have the rights to use it based on his licensing information, copy the CSS locally into a file locally. Number 3, incorporate or reference that CSS file in your document. And then the last thing, of course, is just add whatever CSS you want. So in this case, it's just a class. Add it to the element that I want to have that effect. So pretty straightforward. And again, this is just one example of thousands of different CSS styles, effects, layouts, whatever that are out there that developers have made available for you to use. Again, notice that there is a link here, licenses. Read through that, make sure that they're not requesting payment, make sure that it's okay to use on whatever kind of site it is that you're developing. The other example, something called Bootstrap. This is, I would refer to this as more of a framework. Again, though, component, library, framework, there are probably other words. They basically all mean the same thing in this situation. It's just code that has been created and sort of bundled together to be reused. So reusable sets of code. That's what all these things are. Bootstrap, though, again, I refer to as more of a framework because it's not just like with this hover thing. This hover thing is just hover effects, so it's very specific and limited. Bootstrap is this huge library of CSS that you can incorporate into your site that helps you do everything from create complicated layouts like 3 columns, rows, to button effects. Of course, now I'm forgetting all of the things. So there's a bunch of examples in here. Oh yeah, these like carousel effects, charts, just a whole bunch of stuff. Different navigational elements, sign-in boxes, form elements. So it's all just CSS, but it's sort of predefined CSS that you can selectively use to help speed along your design process, basically. So rather than figuring out what floats to add, or if you want to use Flexbox or Grid, you can just use to create your layout. You can just pull in the Bootstrap framework and then go through the documentation for layouts and sort of quickly create, actually I guess it's Grid, quickly create, a 3-column layout like this using just this little bit of code. So to give you an idea, based on the Bootstrap documentation, by the way, when you're dealing with these frameworks, which are, components that have a lot more options, they get a lot more complicated. So I'm just giving a very basic overview here. But if you look through the documentation, it shows you that this is how you can pull in the Bootstrap library. So this is, again, just an external CSS file that we're bringing in. Notice, though, that I didn't copy and paste it locally. And you can if you want, but I'm referencing it from this CDN or Content Delivery Network. Just a different way to do things. So you're pulling in the library or the framework. And then I have basically copied and pasted this example right here. So this Bootstrap framework is a little bit different than what we saw with the hover library because it is mostly just adding in these classes that have been predefined in the Bootstrap library, but there is, in some cases, also a specific way you have to create your markup or your HTML. So when you want to create a grid like this, you actually have to have it contained inside of a container div with a class called row. And then each of your columns is a separate div or an HTML structural element. It doesn't have to be a div, but that has these classes. So to give you an idea of how that works, here are my 3 boxes. And the advantage of using this Bootstrap layout is I don't have to actually create the additional media queries to get this responsiveness here, to have it go from a 3-column layout to a stacked 1-column layout for mobile, because that is already built in to Bootstrap. So again, this is another advantage to using these libraries. There's a lot of stuff that's already built in, has already been created and tested, and you can just sort of reap the benefits of these libraries. Of course, there's always going to be stuff that you have to do, so you can just sort of start with this framework to get the basic layout down, and then you add your custom styling on top. Yeah, so that's basically it. So these are examples of using CSS components, also called libraries, also called frameworks. Again, the idea being there are sort of predefined reusable collections of CSS code that someone else has developed, and you can leverage those in your own projects to, sort of add on additional styling and functionality to what you're creating. Again, make sure you pay attention to licensing. A lot of these say they're free to use, but not on maybe like a corporate site or a site where you're getting money or something like that. So just pay attention to that. So that's basically it. I guess the main thing I want to get across though is these are really, really essential and useful. And most of the projects I work on, I'm incorporating at least 1 to 2 or more of these different libraries. Again, not that you can create it all from scratch, but in a lot of cases, it just helps speed along the development process, and you can tack on this library and still customize on top of that as needed. Let me know if you have questions.